Hello and welcome back to the AI Ethics Now podcast. My name is Tom Ritchie and I'm really pleased today to be joined by Christian Lund, co-founder of Templify, the leading AI-powered document generation platform. Christian, hello.
Hello, thanks for having me.
I wonder, Christian, if we could start very broadly, just what brings you to this discussion on AI, please?
Yes, well, I've been spending the majority of my career, the past 20 years or so, around document generation in some form, all the way from template management to more orchestrated document automation. And obviously, especially over the past couple of years, that has really taken a turn towards AI. So we've been having to look very deeply into that, and especially because we're dealing a lot with enterprise customers and large organizations where also the ethical parts plays a big role.
Thank you. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more about why do you think most AI projects are failing to deliver on that return on investment, please?
Yeah, I think when AI obviously has been around for a long, long time, but in more sort of general availability over the past couple of years, especially sort of triggered by ChatGPT. I think what really happened first was that organizations, companies around the world were starting to think about there's a new opportunity for these brains that can do stuff. First of all, there was a lot of sort of being very impressed. There is now something that looks a little bit like a human brain that's really interesting for us. Then, fast forward, it turned into being very large investments in actually trying to do consolidation of knowledge around AI. So what we've seen at least is that many companies have been investing quite heavily in building out these new brains. And now they have them actually to a large extent. There are these new brains which are more specialized models or rack around the models and all these terminologies that we now have become familiar with that have created these brains. But what is missing, and also to the question you're asking, is a little bit the body around the brain. So what are the arms and legs that actually turns these brains into something that is actually useful in a business context? And that is also really what's going on right now. So the gap that has been there, I think, for the past year or so at least, and the reason why we're seeing what is actually the return on investment coming out of AI, why that is coming up is because it's been difficult to turn that into a real value because you're missing these sort of last mile delivery opportunities to do that.
And are there any patterns that you're seeing in organizations that are perhaps have led to this failure previously that they're learning from, as you've mentioned? Is it something specific? Is it a technical problem or is it just how they're approaching implementation?
Yeah, I would say it's not a technical problem. It's probably overestimating what you would be able to expect from AI. Because the way we like to look at it, at least, is that it's essentially the first time where we're able to replicate what goes on in the real world with technology, and hence the name, artificial intelligence. And if you were to do some of the things, like if you wanted to do things like we do, like document generation, and you have a project that includes a document, and you had two options. You could go to a very generalist person or the first person you meet at the coffee counter and give them like a little bit of context, and you would expect to get a certain result. And you would compare that result with the scenario where you go to an expert, a subject matter expert that maybe been working with other expert underneath that to deliver something on the back of a good brief that you gave them. Of course, the results would be different. And that speaks back to some of the overestimation, I would say, the unfair expectations to AI that was there in the beginning. That with a little bit of context from some random person, you would be able to get fantastic outputs. It doesn't really work like that in the real world. And as you start replicating that into a digital world with AI, it also doesn't work. So that's also what I think the world is growing up to now, that you need to put a lot more context into the whole process around AI to be able to get to trustable outputs, so something you can actually use for business purpose at least.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's a really important point you make around the trust in the output. I think in an education context as well, we're having the same discussions with students about how they're using AI, almost what they're using it for and what the benefit is. That kind of information seeking activity, the things that you could go and find through Google, but AI just shortens the time frame. Or if you're trying to develop and learn skills around writing an essay or something, which I know is different from a business context, but we're having the same discussions about actually what's the value here for users as well. And talking about that idea of value, I wonder if you could speak a little bit more about the last mile delivery of AI value and why you think that's so hard to achieve.
I mean, I can use the example of what we're doing here. We're trying to help businesses generate business documents which are meant as a vehicle for information, and context to an end recipient. That's kind of what they do. They document the work that especially knowledge workers are doing. That's the purpose of them. And essentially, there are two sort of main components, because one is that as you go through that process, and especially for business documents, you're looking at literally hundreds of billions of them every year being created. So there's a big component that has to do with time reduction. How can I do this faster? Which originally was the big promise of AI. And when you saw the first videos coming out, it's like unbelievable how quickly this can be done on the back of a little bit of information. I get to results incredibly fast. So the big promise was speed originally. But then, to the reason why it's been difficult to turn that into real value, the other component was missing originally, and that's the quality piece. In order for you to use it for anything, you need to be confident enough on the quality that that is actually something that can drive value. So essentially, it speaks back to those three sort of main value driver that kind of drives everything. One, can I save time on doing things when I go into something new? Two, can I make more money or generate revenue from it? And three, can I reduce risk? Those three components continue to be incredibly important. But for us, that means, how confident can you be on the completion of a document? Where the completion speaks about how quickly can I get done, but the confidence speaks about how much can I trust it. So it's really been a race around figuring out how to bring that quality component into what AI is doing, and of course still attach it to real use cases. And I think a big part of the mistake was really that there was so much emphasis on speed alone, and it looked so impressive. But once you double click it, it's actually useless, because it just comes with a new risk that you won't be able to use it unless you spend an equal amount of time just reviewing the whole thing to get back. And then you haven't really won, because you end back in a place where you're still equally reliant on the person doing the job. Now they just need to do the prompting or to set the direction for the AI, and they need to do the review, unless you can put in extra capabilities that allows you to get past that a little bit. And that's, by the way, where we think agents, which is this little software component in the middle between the human and the AI, can really play a big role to give a little bit more orchestration, seen from the organizational perspective of putting more controls around what actually is going on, to add more emphasis to the quality piece.
And the quality piece, I think, is so important. And again, it comes up in so many different contexts about using AI and making sure that it's great that it's super quick, but is it valuable, what we're getting out of this, whether it's in a business context, education context, whatever. And I wonder, though, you mentioned about this quality piece, and do you think there's something specific that's stopping organizations from bridging that gap between being able to develop and use different AI tools and that quality piece? Is there something specific, or is it just, this is new, we're still getting used to this? What is it? Is there something deeper there that perhaps would be useful to think about?
I think there is something deeper. There is also a part of just all the models getting better, and you can send them back to the gym and they come back stronger and they can do more. But we also think that there's a better or faster way to get there, actually, and that is back to the context piece. So when there used to be a frame, we heard a lot about content is king. Now we actually think it's more context, and that really drives things forward, especially around AI. So you want to make sure that you have more emphasis on the context. So for us, for example, that would be, if you want to build out a business document for a specific purpose, all we need to understand is your intent. And on the back of your intent, then we have other means that would say, if that is your intent, I think I'm going to lead you to this model that is pretty good at doing this, but I'm also going to make sure that I provide you with this context, which could then be knowledge sources that sits within the company, things you're allowed to use that is under the control of the company, and things like that. So you start providing more and more context to what the AI is actually supposed to be doing, and that's a big way of driving things towards something you can actually trust more. And I know I used the analogy before, but it's very similar to what you would be doing in a real world without technology, that you need to make sure that you provide direction and context to the person that you're collaborating with if you want to get good results. And that's essentially where I think it's been missing a lot, to make sure you actually do that. The other thing that sort of comes with that, especially from an organizational or enterprise perspective, is that it is also the opportunity to put a little bit more guardrails and control around what happens when the context that is given to AI is not only and solely reliant on a person, but it's a combination between what a person's intent is and what they're trying to do, and then extra context that you can give it or content that you can give it as part of the process, where you have good knowledge around best practices in the business that you can then start replicating and build into these workflows.
Yeah, and I really like what you said about context is king. And I think your final point there about the role of the individual, or the role of how these machines are being, for want of a better term, programmed. I think what I was thinking about the entire time was, but how do we then make sure that bias is being considered in this? Because of whatever context we give will always have a bias in it. That will result just because of the nature of who we are as humans. And I wonder, with that in mind, do you have any thoughts on how you can ensure that AI is benefiting everyone in an organization and not just certain groups?
Yeah, it's a tough question to ask, because I also said earlier that where you can really start finding great value, at least in my opinion, from AI, is also the closer you get to the actual use case of what you're trying to achieve, the better it can help you. And that goes in the other direction of, let's make sure this is something that works really well for everybody. But there are certain things, so you need to look for the places where this can have the biggest impact for the largest amount of people. And that, of course, could be many. We've seen some good results where it just supports you with generating. One thing I think AI is really good at is to overview very large pools of information very quickly and distill it to something that actually can be useful for you. And we've seen great examples of what that can do through, chatbots and things like that, that just helps you distill knowledge very quickly and support you in that way. I think that's a great way. But if you want to take it further, that's where you need to look at some of those replicable, or rather repeatable, processes that happens all the time, which is why, as I've been saying a few times, business document is a good place to look, because it's something that no one was hired to do almost, and everyone has to do. And it's something that should be taken care of by other than yourself, because you're hired to do a different job, but you need this vehicle to sort of process the information that you need to bring on to the next person. So that's a good example of when the magnitude is big enough to start focusing in on those areas, and to make sure you can actually be helpful across a large pool of people, and make sure that they can do, as I said, what they were hired to do, or what they do best.
Yeah, and I understand that. And I think it's really interesting to hear you talk about it in the context of your role within Templify as well, because I think we've not spoken about that a huge amount in terms of exactly what you do. And I'm sure it will come up in the next couple of questions. But it would be really interesting to understand how you, as a co-founder, really work to balance the AI innovation that you're engaging in with kind of enterprise control within the organization, and how you're leading in the AI innovation element within Templify, but how you're making that work on a day-to-day basis. How are you balancing that innovation?
Yeah, it is a very good question, and something that has been top of our mind from the get-go, actually. So we were honestly a little bit late on getting onto the it's a race about being fast. We actually started with, well, quality has to be at the center, otherwise you won't go anywhere. And actually the speed component was something that we picked up a little bit later. And it was because, to your point, like specifically for enterprises or large public organizations as well, typically there is just a higher bar for quality. And the cost of making mistakes, or the risk rather, is just very, very big. So it's one of the reasons why you wouldn't jump on the AI train, just because of that risk, which is, if you come from the other side, smaller businesses, they have a lot more wriggle room to do stuff that is a little bit more elaborate, and they don't have to worry too much about those biases or AI getting nuts a little bit sometimes around certain things. But the control piece was really big for us from the get-go. And one thing we had, the questions we had asked from very early on from them was, is there a way where we can use the same type of interfaces for users providing input or intent of what they're trying to do, but direct that to specific models that we control, that we trust, that is not part of a learning source for a bigger general model that is out there? Is there a way we can connect that to specific knowledge sources that we control inside of the company? So we use that for grounding of good results, because we have a trust in that source of what good looks like. This is our best practice. That's what we want to replicate on. And is there a way where different questions that we want to send to AI can go to different models and different knowledge sources? So that whole orchestration piece was very evident for us from the get-go, that in order to be successful around enterprises and large organizations, you have to be really good at adding that layer as well. It's not enough just to have the AI and a user. In the middle, you need to have something that orchestrates this. So, an example I would use that we kind of fell on early on was Microsoft obviously have a product called Copilot. And we were wondering when they came out on what the reason for the naming of that was. If that's the Copilot, then who's flying the plane? Who's the pilot? And I think originally the way they thought about it was, well, the pilot is the user because that's the one giving direction. And we thought from the beginning, at least in larger enterprises or organizations, the user plays a role for sure, but it's more the passenger. It's the person who knows I know my destination. I know where I want to go, but I'm not flying the plane. We need to have the business in the driver's seat to make sure that all the controls that sit around this is something that is more control from the business or the enterprise level to do that, to make sure that the users will get to where they need to go without having to know all that orchestration by magic. So we actually thought that was a mistake, and to sort of get that out and make sure that you actually would put the right person in the driver's seat. And you could argue now that it's more the pilot is maybe perhaps the business, also in Microsoft terminology, collaborating with a co-pilot that then is able to also collaborate with the end user. That was very evident from us from the get-go, and I think we've only been sort of confirmed in that logic ever since.
Yeah, thank you, Christian. And I wonder, how do you know when you've got it right versus perhaps too much control in those examples that you've mentioned? Is there a sweet spot, or is it a case-by-case basis?
Well, the way that I look at it and we look at it, it's almost like there's a little bit of a sliding scale. So we're working with this terminology that we call confident completion around document generation, to again use that as an example, which essentially means on the back of the tools that you're using, how complete can you be with your task and how confident can you be around the completion of that task? And that actually comes with a range, because if I would use one of our tools that we have in the tool stack is a generalist agent that is good at creating any document you throw at it, a universal document agent. You throw anything at it and it's going to give you results. But the expectations to what it does are also limited because it's generalist. So you're confident that it would definitely take you like 30% of the way. And you're very confident with the structure and the template that it's using and certain things like that. It might take you further than 30%, but if you go beyond 30%, you want to take a closer look at what actually comes out on the other side. And then we have other tools that allow you to take it further, where you start using more specialized agents that are good at certain things. And you can sort of take it further on the deliberacy and the specialization of what AI should do and what the agents are doing. That sort of takes you down that road to get you further when you're actually more confident on the first piece and you leave less to chance, so to speak, or for users to sort of iterate over. That's sort of the conceptual piece. How you get to those confidentiality levels is again about controlling the context, the content, and the data that you provide as part of the process. How confident you are of understanding the intent of the user, and how confident you can be of, because of that, what you piece together for that user to use. So that is where, again, like I'm back to what I've been saying a couple of times, the whole orchestration piece is extremely important, because that is where the organization has an opportunity to sort of inject itself between what the user is trying to do and what actually is the output, because they have all the sources to ground everything in best practices, and also to make sure that they don't go rogue on things they shouldn't be saying. They follow certain rules and guidelines from the company, and they kind of stay within certain guardrails on that. And it's also a way for them to sort of stay within the more ethical boundaries, I would say.
You mentioned a lot about the orchestration, and as you said, it's come up a couple of times, and it's a really interesting way of thinking about this that we've not perhaps spoken about before on this podcast. Within my context in education, there are so many colleagues who are trying to develop new AI tools and new AI platforms for students to use and for others to use within education. And it'll be the same for you in business. You'll be seeing lots of new projects coming up and being developed all the time. And I wonder, is the difference between success and failure in this AI development and AI adoption, is that just orchestration, or is there something else you think that's behind that, that's separating the kind of successful examples from those that are failing?
It's not just orchestration, because it starts really with understanding how we can be most helpful. Honestly, it's like, is there a use case? Is actually something that is going to be, is AI even the best capability that you can apply to a certain problem or not? So it's always that mix in terms of, you want to go from A to B because you want to achieve something new. What are then the required capabilities that would help you get there? And that's, by the way, not always AI. Oftentimes it's definitely not, or it's a combination between different technologies. But there are definitely places where it is AI. I think where orchestration comes in very, very strong is to continue to strengthen the quality of the output, as we've already been discussing. And the other side of it is that I would argue the tools that don't have that orchestration piece are also very exposed to actually being commoditized very quickly, even by AI itself, because it's so capable of replicating, once you had the thought, the ability to build out new tools or technologies, even with AI, is a lot quicker as well. So they're very exposed as well to being that, which is not necessarily negative in itself, unless you're the one actually driving that business. But it speaks to sort of the iteration process. Once you have that layer where you have AI doing all the work, then you're also exposed to that. But at the end of the day, especially when you get into certain types of use cases, and especially when you're speaking enterprise or sort of business organization type of work, that is where I would say you would need this little butler that sits in the orchestration layer that makes sure that everything actually goes on in certain ways that you can trust and have done before, and would actually deliver sort of reliable outputs at scale.
I really like the way that you framed that, and it's helped me understand, I think, a little bit more about the difference between success and failure in some of this work. And actually, I wonder if that orchestration level is perhaps something that we might be missing within an education context sometimes, where because of the nature of how we work, it's a lot more fragmented. We don't perhaps have the same structures in place, and it's sometimes just individuals trying to innovate in a very specific context that they're working in. I wonder though, Christian, with all of that said, and I ask every guest this, how do you think we can ensure a more positive future with AI, please?
What we are doing, and I think what a lot of companies are doing, a lot of innovators are doing right now, is to try to do that, just that, like help people get rid of the tasks that are not necessarily value creating for them, but are just a necessity underneath, or get to decision making foundations quicker, is another thing I've seen AI do really well. To be able to overview a lot of information incredibly fast and have that distilled to help people make better decisions is the very sort of overarching logic around that. And I do think that that has a ton of potential and is in itself like incredibly positive across a lot of different business lines and industry and science and what have we. So I think what we are doing, and what everyone I know is doing, is to use all the positive side around AI. What is the more difficult part? I'm not sure that's part of your question, but that is also the other side of what these brains can be used for, because obviously there's opportunity in all directions, as it's always been with technology. If there's another side of the medal, and for that I have to be honest, I don't have the answer to how to put in those controls. But I do think that we can put a lot of emphasis on highlighting where it's actually possible to be successful with AI when you want to do something for the greater good of humanity, and also what it requires to be successful around it.
Yeah, and it's a really interesting and kind of rich answer, and I think it's helped me think about perhaps AI implementation in a different way than perhaps previous conversations have. So thank you so much, Christian. It's been really, really interesting to chat with you and to learn more about Templify and the approach that you're taking around AI and enterprise. And as you mentioned, the kind of context, the orchestration pieces. Thank you so much for joining. And yeah, really looking forward to speaking again soon. Have a lovely day. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much.